We found this book in the public domain, public access. No copyright infringement was intentional. We bring this particular book, the Book of Wisdom, to all via this video for educational purposes alone. The Book of Wisdom is more than a repository of ancient wisdom and a venerable text of moral religious philosophy which prevailed in the Jewish Hellenistic world 2,000 years ago. It is undoubtedly intrinsically important as an historic religious work in the twilight zone during which Judaism reached maturity and also gave birth to Christianity. However, in common with all the inspired works of Scripture, it has a value and significance that transcend the limitations of the time and circumstances which gave birth to this religious classic. No unanimity of opinion exists regarding its many facets in authorship, in birthplace, the original language in which it was composed, the date of its origin, the authenticity of its theological tenets, or its relationship to the philosophical currents then prevailing. Dr. Rita marshals the various conflicting scholarly opinions, and after carefully weighing all the evidence and opinions, advances his own conclusions. Dropsy College Edition, Jewish Apocryphal Literature. The Book of Wisdom in English translation with introduction and commentary by Joseph Reeder, published for the Dropsy College for Hebrew and Cognate Learning by Harper and Brothers, New York. And here's a note up here. Bible Old Testament Apocrypha, Wisdom of Solomon, English 1957. Forward by Abraham A. Newman. With the appearance of this volume, the Book of Wisdom, the Dropsy College series of Jewish apocryphal literature, is introducing to its readers a work which is more than a repository of ancient wisdom and a venerable text of moral religious philosophy which prevailed in the Jewish Hellenistic world 2,000 years ago. The Book of Wisdom is undoubtedly intrinsically important as a historic religious work in the twilight zone. We already read that. On the inside sleeve. The resultant picture may not be entirely clear, but its outlines are firmly drawn. The author, who is anonymous, was an Alexandrian Jew, Greek in speech and thought, and a Jew in religion and in moral sensitivity. He was a citizen of two contrasting worlds. He lived and had his being in two competing civilizations. On the one hand, there was the Greek world, intellectually alluring, worshipful of beauty and art, hedonistic and sensuous. On the other hand, there was deeply rooted in his soul the Hebrew conscience, a pervading sense of duty inspired by godliness, a feeling of holiness, and a conviction of divine destiny. The author was at home in the Greek surroundings. He loved beauty. He was versed in the various schools of philosophic thought without adhering to any one system consistently. His religious ideas were coloured by Hellenistic concepts, but the garb of Hellenism was merely the outward garment that covered his inner being. In depth and in truth, he was the offspring of biblical wisdom. His wisdom was a distillation of Hebraic experiences and insights. His love of beauty may have been Hellenistically inspired, but his Hebraic conscience revolted against its sublimation and the moral decadence which was its consequence. To the author, beauty as a creation of the divine was uplifting. As an end in itself, as the incorporation of divinity, it was idolatry, the denial of the true God, the author of all. Steeped as he was in Greek philosophy, his interest was not in intellectual speculation. A vision captivated his heart and soul, the vision of wisdom. Wisdom not in the mundane sense pertaining to human relationships, but wisdom as a mystic creation, an emanation of the divine essence, existence before the creation of the world, and participating with God in its formation. The title of the book is obviously derived from this profoundly mystic concept. but even more so, the entire book is inspired by its religious motivation. Notwithstanding the lofty suprahuman altitude in which the author's concept of wisdom is poised, the author is not writing in a vacuum. The tormenting questions concerning life and death, how to explain evil and injustice in a world created by a God of love and justice, or the nature of divine retribution, immortality of the soul, the ultimate destiny of humanity in Israel. These are the problems to which the author applies the canons derived from Hebrew wisdom. The author was directing himself in the first instance to his co-religionists in Alexandria and throughout the Hellenistic diaspora, because so many of his brethren were falling prey to the allurements of Hellenism. Loss of faith in Israel's religion and destiny and outright apostasy constituted mortal danger to the continued existence of the Jewish people. He laid bare the moral weaknesses and fallacies on which the glamorous, idolatrous civilization rested. Living in an Egyptian environment, he boldly invokes the testimony of history in denunciation of Egypt and in glorification of Israel. While Israel is portrayed under favoured divine providence, the author, like the preceding Hebrew prophets, firmly held on to the universal vision of God as the Father of all men and all creation. The detailed analysis of the Book of Wisdom by many scholars has proved amply rewarding in relation to the history of Judaism and Christianity. In its general overtones, this classic bears relevance also to our times, to the perplexed generation of the author's kin, or his kind, or his generation, who are being lured away from Jewish loyalties by the more glamorous trappings of a materialistic civilization. The appeal of the Book of Wisdom is prophetic. Equally, so does the voice of wisdom speak forcefully to the nations of the world. Love righteousness, you that be judges of the earth. Think of the Lord in goodness, and in simplicity of heart seek you him. It is fitting to conclude with a few words of appreciation to Dr. Solomon Zeitlin, Editor-in-Chief of the Jewish Apocryphal Literature series. He gives thanks to all the people involved. This act is in true consonance with the dictate of Jewish wisdom to celebrate epochal events in life not through lavish display but by aiding in the production of enduring cultural creations. Contents page. The Book of Wisdom. Introduction. Chapter 1. Title. The all but universal title, Wisdom of Solomon, derives from the original Greek title. Manuscript B. In Manuscript N. Manuscript A of the Septuagint. The Syriac version, known as Peshitta, entitles it Hoc Meta Rabati de Shedomo, the Great Wisdom of Solomon, but the Syriac, in Walton's Polyglot, adds the following remark, concerning which there is doubt whether some other Hebrew sage, writing in the spirit of prophecy, did not compose it in the name of Solomon, and it was so accepted. The Old Latin version, known as Itala, has simply Liber Sapientiae, Book of Wisdom, which is acceptable to modern critics. Of the Greek Church Fathers, Epiphanius and Pseudo-Athanasius call it, and there is in the Greek, that looks like Logia, the all-virtuous wisdom. Clement of Alexandria and Oregon, the divine wisdom. Of the Latin Church Fathers, Augustine called it Liber Christianae Sapientiae, Book of Christian Wisdom. Jerome characterizes it as pseudepigraphus and says it was entitled Sapientia Salomonis, the Wisdom of Solomon. And there's some footnotes here. The most extraordinary title of the Book of Wisdom is found in the Muratorian Canon, Sapientia Salomonis, ab Musis Salomonis, etc., etc. Tregelles suggest ingeniously that amicus might stand for in the Greek original, which was mistaken for by the friends. Okay, let me get a bit bigger so you can see that Greek. There's the Greek there. Contents. The chapter 2 contents. According to subject matter, the Book of Wisdom may be divided into two main parts, each of which may be further subdivided. 1, chapters 1 to 9, expatiate on the role of wisdom in human life and experience. 1 to 5 enumerate in detail the moral demands of wisdom and her corresponding rewards. 6 to 9 describes in glowing colours the nature of wisdom and her supernal powers. 2. Chapters 10 to 19 furnish illustrations of wisdom's power from the ancient history of Israel. 10f deal with the patriarchs and the exodus from Egypt. 12 is devoted to the Canaanites. 13 to 15 constitute a digression on idolatry. 16 to 19 contrast God's treatment of Israel with his treatment of the Egyptians. Brett Schneider, and some footnotes down the bottom here, may explain who that person was. Divided the book into 3 distinct parts. Chapter 1 to 6 and 8, which he styled Book of Eschatology. Chapter 6, 9 to 10, Paean or Panegyric on wisdom. Chapter 11 to 19, historical retrospect with a tract on idolatry or polytheism. Containing the claim to Solomonic authorship and references to Platonic philosophy. Different in contents and style from the other two parts, sometimes characterized as a Passover sermon. This threefold division, or something similar to it, read those footnotes, is most generally adopted by commentators and exegetes. The first 10 chapters are far superior to the rest of the book in point of thought. True, the thought is not that of a systematic or consistent thinker, yet it evidences the strong conviction of a great religious spirit, who was aware of the stress and strain of life and yet refused to abandon his ancestral belief in a God of righteousness. It is in these first chapters that the writer boldly enunciates the doctrine of immortality immediately after death, denies that suffering presupposes sin, refuses to admit that early death is necessarily a calamity, or that childlessness is a mark of divine displeasure. Compared to them, the last 9 chapters, which are homiletic and Haggadic in character, weaving a pattern of salvation for Israel, the God intoxicated in destruction for Egypt, the idolatrous, are far inferior with their laboured diction and dragging periods, with their repetitions and wordiness. In a more detailed way, the book opens with an address to kings and potentates of the world, whom evidently the author wishes to influence in favour of the Jews, but apparently the discourse is intended for all men of whatever station in life. First comes an appeal to love righteousness, which is the only way leading to wisdom, unrighteousness being alien to it and leading to death and destruction, unwilled by God. Chapter 1. Then a vivid picture is drawn of the wicked, who, observing the absence of just compensation in this world and denying future retribution, abandon themselves to sensual enjoyment here. Moreover, they hate and persecute the righteous, because they are reproved by them for their wicked deeds, or exposed, and he corrected on it. Chapter 2. There follows a contrast between the righteous, whose sufferings in this world are only a chastening, and whose hope is full of immortality and transcendental happiness, and the wicked, whose life even here is miserable, and whose offspring are cursed. 3:1 to 12. Here the observation is made that happiness does not consist in children and old age, for virtue without children is better than vice. There's a footnote here. In regards to this statement, virtue without children is better than vice with children, and the truly venerable age is wisdom and probity. 3:13, 4 and 9. The general argument is resumed, and it is stressed that the value of righteousness will be shown hereafter, when good men, being despised by the wicked, will be blessed, whilst the wicked, pursued by divine wrath, will be forced to acknowledge the folly of their course. 14 to 5:23. Here comes a renewal of the address to kings to heed wisdom, so that they may govern worthily and be assured of immortality. 6 1 to 21. Followed by the personal experience of King Solomon, who had prayed for wisdom, and it was granted him, and an enumeration of the great virtues of wisdom and the benefits derived therefrom. 6:22 to 9:18. At this point begins a historical retrospect purporting to show how the past generations were guided by wisdom, specifically the patriarchs from Adam to Joseph, but especially Moses, who led the Israelites victoriously out of Egypt. Chapter 10. Contrasted to the Israelites are the Egyptians and Canaanites, who in defiance of wisdom worshipped false gods, and consequently were punished grievously, though they were not wholly destroyed, or completely destroyed, giving them a chance for repentance. The Egyptians especially were punished by means of their own animal gods, in order to make them acknowledge the true God, whom they formerly denied. 11:1 to 12 to 37. Well, supposedly their animal gods, they basically venerated them. Some say they worshipped them, Christians, etc., but others in the Kemetic society today say no, they venerated them. They were symbolic. Okay. They venerated the sun because it provided heat, produced life, vegetation, etc., etc. It's a mix, so it's up to the individual to do their own personal research and establish the facts, find the evidence that proves itself evident, that's irrefutable, etc., that these Egyptians were actually animal god worshippers. The argument is interrupted by a lengthy discourse on idolatry, its nature, its origin, and many varieties, such as the worship of the forces of nature, or beasts, or stones and images fashioned by human hands. This idolatry, which originated in a desire to honour dead children and kings, and was abetted by skilled artists who carved attractive images, led to moral corruption and all the frightful vices of society, from which Israel kept free, whilst its enemies were engulfed by it. Chapter 13 to 15. After this digression, the historical retrospect is resumed, and a contrast is drawn between the punishments of the Egyptians and those of the Israelites. God did indeed send plagues on Israel as on Egypt, but whereas the former came as chastisement only and were not altogether destructive, the latter were utterly devastating, culminating in the destruction of the Egyptian firstborn. Chapter 16 to 18. Finally, an account is given of the passage of the Red Sea, when the Egyptians were drowned for their treachery to strangers, whilst the Israelites waded through safely and proceeded to fresh conquests. Thus in all things God magnified and glorified his people, so they were chosen of God, in spite of his enemies. Chapter 19. And here's some footnotes here below. A very detailed analysis of the contents of the Book of Wisdom is given by Reverend J.A.F. Gregg in the introduction to his commentary in the Cambridge Bible for Schools and Colleges, paragraph 69 to 62, maybe 52. Maybe it might be 49 to 52. But to check it out. No. 3. Text. The Greek text of Septuagint is paramount, and that looks like it might be 49 to 52. Okay. Text. The Greek text of Septuagint is paramount, and all of it is found in the great uncials, Sinaiticus, A. Alexandrius, and B. Vaticanus. It is incomplete in C. Codex Ephraemi Rescriptus. As to cursives, there are about a dozen listed in the classic edition of Holmes and Parsons. Vetus Testamentum Graecium, etc., etc. Oxford, 1798 to 1827, volume 5. Most important of which appears to be 248, embodying very ancient elements and frequently quoted by Margoliouth in his article on this book. 17. In the Journal of the Royal Asiatic Society for 1890, paragraph 263, 297. There is no critical edition of the original Greek text. The edition of Holmes and Parsons quoted above, though based on numerous manuscripts, is far from accurate and is besides quite antiquated. The larger Cambridge edition of the Septuagint by Brooke and Maclean began to appear in 1887 and has been reprinted many times. Which is supposed to replace it, has not yet reached the Book of Wisdom. Sweet's admirable short Cambridge edition, okay, that's the one that began to appear in 1887 and has been reprinted many times. Okay, this other one of Maclean's, that appeared, it's been around, or appeared 1906 and onward. Sweet's admirable shorter Cambridge edition, though based on all the important uncials, is confined to only a limited number of cursive manuscripts. Many interesting variants in the cursives are given by Grimm, Holtzmann, and especially Feldman in their commentaries and treatises. The latest edition of the Septuagint by A. Ralphs, published by the Privileged, there's something in German here, in Stuttgart, 1935. Gives an arbitrary corrected text based of course on various lections, but sometimes, or various lectures, but sometimes also on the individual judgment of the editor. Maybe that's Latin. Varied lectures maybe. Yet it seemed both feasible and practical to use this text in the present edition of the Book of Wisdom, together with the most important critical notes. As a matter of fact, in this particular book it differs only very slightly from the text of Sweet, and never in essential matters. There are scholars who doubt that the Greek text as it has been preserved pure and pristine. There are scholars who doubt that the Greek text as it is has been preserved pure and pristine. On the contrary, as in many other ancient texts which had gone through various vicissitudes, they are convinced that here too are some interpolations. Thus, for example, Grates this book here on the Jews, 3444, page 444, believed that the Book of Wisdom had been manipulated by some Christian scribe who interpolated in it at least the following four passages. 2:24, here it is in the Greek. By the envy of the devil death entered into the world. She who has not conceived in transgression. 4:1, better than this is childlessness with virtue. Blessed has been wood through which comes righteousness. For a discussion of these passages, see their commentary ad hoc. So they might have added something to it. That's what he's saying. Some Christian scribe could have added to it, added certain things to it. The old Latin version, Itala, seems to be of North African origin and belongs to the 2nd century CE for the Christian era. Many words found in it occur only in African writers, such as Tertullian and Augustine. It is certain that Jerome, in preparing the Vulgate, did not revise the already existing Latin translations of the Wisdom. This version is generally faithful to the Greek, but contains also some additions. glosses, paraphrases, or variant renderings. The Syriac version seems to have been made from the Greek and corrected from some other sources, notably the Old Latin. This version exists in 3 different recensions: the Peshitta, printed in Walton's Polyglot, and also with slight differences from a British Museum manuscript by Lagarde. The Syro-Hexapolaric text published by A.M. Siriani, and a fragment of a Palestinian version from a Bodleian manuscript made known by George Henry Gilliam. With regard to the Peshitta, it is paraphrastic down to the end of chapter 10, but from that point onwards, according to Goodrick, it would almost seem that another interpreter had taken the task in hand, who had little or no knowledge of Greek. For purposes of textual criticism, therefore, this portion of the translation is almost valueless. On this version, generally compare Burkitt in Journal of Theological Studies 2, 1901, page 175. The Hexapolaric text, which is a translation of the Septuagint text of Origen's Hexapla, executed by Paul, Bishop of Tella in Mesopotamia about 617 CE, is slavishly faithful to the letter of the Septuagint, even at the expense of sense, though accompanied by marginal notes and later annotations. So they were probably added later. The Syriac of this version is much later than the Syriac of the Peshitta. As to the Palestinian version, it is understood that it is the text of the Melkite or Greek church in Palestine and Egypt, and that it is written in a dialect more akin to that of the Jewish Targums. On this version, generally you compare Burkitt in Journal of Theological Studies 2, 1901, page 175. An Aramaic translation of Wisdom is mentioned by Nabonidus, 13th century, in the preface to his commentary on the Pentateuch, and has it here in Greek by the looks of it in the footnotes. The quotation is from chapter 7, 5 to 8, 17 and 21. Compare also, there's some more Greek here. See further Alexander Marx, an Aramaic fragment of the Wisdom of Solomon in JBL. It could be 60, or maybe that's 40. 921 57 double F. Also, Azariah Del Rossi attests to the existence of an Aramaic version, but since such a version has not come down to us, it is quite possible that these references are to the Syriac version transcribed in Hebrew characters. See Grimman's commentary, page 9. An Egyptian Sahidic version of Wisdom was published by Lagarde, and then there's also an Ethiopic version, but these are of little critical value. The Arabic version, which is said to be of the 12th century or later, is often paraphrastic, like the Peshitta, yet it never departs much from the Greek text and is occasionally more accurate than the Old Latin. The Armenian version is word true, according to Conybeare. Rushk made a collation of this version, but this has been declared inaccurate and imperfect. Margoliouth made good use of it in his article on the Hebrew origin of the Book of Wisdom. The authorized English version is fairly good and accurate, but the English is at times too diffuse, at times quite inadequate to express the meaning of the Greek. The same may be said also of the English Revised Version, so they're not that great. German translation of Wisdom are numerous, but one with notes by M. Gutmann is particularly valuable for its numerous references to rabbinical literature. And it was published in Altona in 1846. A Hebrew version with an extensive commentary was published by Hartwig Wesley. Here's the Greek. Berlin, 1780. Reissued with an abbreviated commentary, Zolkiwe, 1805, and with a German translation by M. E. Stern, Prague, 1853. But Wesley failed because not having being familiar with Greek, he prepared his version from German and French texts, and besides he could not find Hebrew words to express adequately the philosophical and theological concepts of wisdom. Also, Isaac Frankel rendered into Hebrew the Book of Wisdom among other apocrypha. Leipzig, 1830, and frequently reissued. The version was reissued with similar results. In fact, this is too free and paraphrastic to be called a translation. A newer and much better version into Hebrew was made directly from the Greek by Menahem Stein for Abraham Kahana's edition of the Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha. And it's got that there in Greek. Tel Aviv, 1937, Volume 1, Paragraph 463, 514. Purpose. Various motives have been advanced for the writing of the Book of Wisdom. Some thought that it constituted an attempt to controvert the teachings of Ecclesiastes, according to Nachtigal and many others. For instance, the writer of Wisdom 2:1-9 certainly had Ecclesiastes in mind. 2:1 can only have reference to Ecclesiastes 2:23 and 5:1. 2:2 is reminiscent of Ecclesiastes 3:19. 2:3 recalls Ecclesiastes 12:7. 2:4 is reflected in Ecclesiastes 1:11, and so forth. And 2:5 is based on Ecclesiastes 6:12, etc., etc. But while this opposition to Ecclesiastes may have been one of the writer's motives, it could not have been the chief and only motive. For this, something more positive and urgent is required. Somewhat better is the suggestion of Siegfried that the main purpose of the book is an attempt to reconcile Jewish and Greek philosophy. But this too is only partly true. Naturally, the reconciliation between Jewish thought and Greek philosophy was always before the eyes of Jewish authors in Alexandria, writing in Greek. But this was by no means their chief consideration, certainly not before the days of Philo, who was the first to go about it in a systematic and thorough way. Others, like Berthollet, maintained that the Book of Wisdom was written for the purpose of attracting proselytes to Judaism from among the cultured Greeks. This may be seen from the following considerations. First, that it is permeated by Platonic and Stoic philosophy, and secondly, that it endeavours to explain away, in an allegorical manner, the signs and wonders of the Old Testament which might arouse incredulity in Gentiles or non-Jews. We know that these were precisely the methods employed by the Jewish intellectuals in Alexandria in order to attract Greeks to their religion. They either explained away every point of Jewish history which might give umbrage to a cultured Greek, as Philo did, or they boldly affirmed that Hellenic civilization was borrowed from that of the Jews, as Pseudo-Aristobulus did. But again, this cannot have been the main issue. Actual conversion of pagans to Judaism never was of paramount importance to the Jews, who often enough pleaded for sympathy and tolerance, but not for the acceptance of their beliefs and tenets. There can be no doubt that the purpose of the Book of Wisdom is primarily to strengthen the faith of the pious Jews. This becomes quite evident from a perusal of chapters 6-12 and 6-19. To convert the apostate or renegade Jews to such a faith, and to convince the heathen, or non-Jews, of the folly of the idolatry. It will be recalled that Alexandrian Jewish literature generally aimed at keeping the Jews loyal to their ancestral beliefs and practices, and at convincing the pagans of the folly of their own polytheism and idolatry. In the conception of these writers, the Jews alone had a very great light, while over the heathen was spread a heavy night. Hence the apotheosis of the God of Israel and his surrogate wisdom, the promise of a reward for virtue, if not in this, then in the next world, and a denunciation of materialism, skepticism and idolatry. Judaism in Alexandria was passing through a severe crisis. Having been imported by early Jewish settlers from Palestine and remaining in its pristine purity for some time, it soon came into conflict with the mighty Greek civilization and its alluring splendours, particularly its over-emphasis of materialism over spiritualism and its accentuation of hedonism as against temperance and self-restraint. To some cultured but weak-minded Jews, the beauties and attractions of the Hellenistic civilization were too potent to withstand, and these naturally yield to its blandishments sooner or later. First, imitation would set in, followed by partial and then complete assimilation. And this would inevitably lead to alienation and apostasy. The situation became very alarming, since those Hellenizers and apostates generally entered government service and strove to annoy and harass their former co-religionists by agitating and proselyting among them. There are numerous instances of such inner destructive forces in Alexandrian Jewry. To counteract this nefarious activity of the Hellenizers and apostates, and to contradict it thoroughly and effectively, became the imperative task of the loyal and learned Jews, such as the author of the Book of Wisdom, who knew both the Jewish scripture and Greek philosophy, and could readily discern the advantages of the one and the disadvantages of the other. Thus the Book of Wisdom is really a polemic work, the first 6 chapters directly against the recalcitrant and apostate Jews, the last 10 chapters against vicious idolatry or paganism, then dominant in the Greek world. In accordance with this plan, the author addresses himself specifically to Jews in chapters 1 to 5 and to Gentiles in the rest of the book. In the former, he undoubtedly had in mind the Epicurean Jews, who, under the impress of Greek civilizations, apostatized and mingled with the pagans, sometimes to the detriment of their fellow Jews. For these Epicureans, he extols in sonorous phrases the beauties and marvels of the Jewish faith and its great superiority over any other belief of antiquity. And to them he passionately appeals to return to the belief of their ancestors and to abandon their worldly philosophy. He was grieved to see that his countrymen in Egypt were losing their ancient faith while being tolerated by the Egyptians. His aim was to console and strengthen his people by showing them the bankruptcy of materialism and the futility of idolatry, and by recommending to them the pursuit of wisdom.